Okay, so this is what we have shown so far. If you have a network, you put a flow on top of it, any flow, you can produce then a residual network. If you could put a second flow on this residual network, then what we have shown using this theorem is that this new flow in the residual network plus the old flow in the original network is still a flow in the original network. And that is the reason why we can incrementally do things. Now, there was a very good question at the start of the class, which is essentially that are we assuming anything about these capacities and the flows? Are they integers? Are they rational? This is computer science, and therefore, we cannot represent real numbers. So, they are either integers or rationals. Okay. But let me tell you this, Ford-Fulkerson, here is a question. Ford-Fulkerson essentially is looking for augmenting flows, and when I say augmenting flows, it is looking for a single path from the source to the sink, and the way it augments it is that it runs through the capacities on that path, just on that path, and then chooses the minimum residual capacity, and that becomes a flow. Does Ford-Fulkerson ever produce, assume that you started with integral capacities, so every capacity is an integer out there. Does Ford-Fulkerson ever produce for you a non-integral flow at any intermediate stage? I am assuming that the capacities were all integers to begin with, and I am assuming that Ford-Fulkerson does its job essentially by augmenting flow over and over again. We know exactly how it is augmenting a flow. It is not simply finding a path and just then pulling a flow out of its hat. It finds a path in the residual network. It then scans through the edges on that path, forward edges, finds the one with the minimum residual capacity. It then uses that as the flow through that path. Everything else is 0. So, that is a flow. We know that that flow added to any previous flow on the graph would also be a flow, and so the flow is slowly getting incremental. The question is, at any time does Ford-Fulkerson produce for you a flow that is non-integral, non-integers? No, it does not. Okay. But it is a very specific feature of Ford-Fulkerson. It could have simply gone, chosen the minimum, for some reason said, I am going to push through the minimum divided by 2. It could have done that too, but it does not. There is no point sending through a flow which is less than the flow that you can actually send in. And the flow that you can actually send in a residual network, the way we have set things up, is to have an integral flow. So, Ford-Fulkerson will always have integral kick-ups in flow. That is a feature of Ford-Fulkerson. That does not mean that you cannot have non-integral flows going through it. Yeah. It is a feature of the algorithm. Yeah, remember, Ford-Fulkerson does an augmenting path and puts a flow through the augmenting path. It has a very specific way of choosing that flow. That flow on the augmenting path, remember, a flow is any function between any pair u v that satisfies these constraints. There is a residual network sitting with you, you just have to put a flow through it. You can say, I am going to put a very complicated flow through this one. Some magician is going to come and give me all kinds of numbers everywhere. That could be one way of doing it. Ford-Fulkerson does not do that. Ford-Fulkerson says, I am incrementing things anyway. Why not simply keep adding very simple flows? The flow that Ford-Fulkerson adds is setting every pair of lengths to 0 first, and then finding a path in the residual network from the source to the sink. On that path are these residual capacities. It scans through them, finds a minimum one. We are guaranteed the minimum is currently going to be integer, and then it uses that minimum. It could have actually sent in half that flow. If you can find a path with a minimum capacity of 3, I am sure you can send in 1.5. It does not, it sends in that 3. I did not say that. I did not say that the maximal flow can be non-integral. I said a flow can be non-integral. You are right, the maximum flow will turn out to be integral, but we will prove that. That is also not very obvious, right? Just because you have a 5 and a 3 and a something, it is not the case that you cannot have 4.7 adding to a 0.3 to make a 5. But we will show that the maximum flow will turn out to be integers if the capacities are integers. In other words, you can have a maximum flow which is integers. It is actually easy to show that you can produce non-integer flows, which is also going to hit. Okay? By which I mean that you will see integer some place, but other places will be non-integral. Here is a simple example. Okay. I am just creating an example where I know that this is the bottleneck and it has a capacity of 1. Okay. I know that maybe from this side to that side a 1 goes. I can, regardless of the capacities here, I can actually send in a 0.5 and a 0.5 that will add to be a 1 there. Okay, so I can have flows be non-integers in some lengths. It is just that at the bottleneck it will become the capacity of that. Is that making sense? Okay. So this bottleneck is the next theorem. The next theorem, which is a main theorem in flow networks, is to say that every network has a bottleneck, and the maximum flow is essentially that bottleneck. Okay, we will try to prove that. Okay, it is called the maximum flow, the minimum cut theorem. It could have as well been called the bottleneck theorem. It essentially says that given any flow network, there is something called a bottleneck that we will define. It turns out to be a cut through the network, and the maximum flow you can send out through this network is going to be the capacity of that bottleneck. Okay. It is a very powerful theorem, and in fact, we will use this theorem to show that any incremental technique that slowly hits a point and then cannot do any more augmentation is essentially going to hit exactly the bottleneck. And once you hit the bottleneck, there is no way you can go beyond the bottleneck, and that is going to be the maximum possible flow through your network. Okay. So, let us first define a couple of things. So, we are going to define something called a cut. This cut is exactly going to be the same cut as we defined long back. In what context did we define a cut? Minimum spanning trees. Yeah, so some of you have it in you, the others have just have a K-pop, right? So, the only additional constraint we are going to assume is that the source node sits on the left side and the sink node sits on the right side. So, you do not want to produce a cut where you flip things. So, it's all it is saying is that I am going to define a cut to be anything where you have some of the vertices sitting on this side, all remaining vertices sitting on the other side. It is a partition. So, you cannot have a vertex sitting on both sides, plus your source will sit on the S side and your sink will sit on the T side. This is going to be the capacity of your cut. You are only looking at edges going from the left to the right. Mind you are summing up over all u's in S, v's in T, capacity from U to V. You are not looking at the opposite side. Okay, so, it is essentially what is the stuff that you can send from the left to the right. Mathematically, you say flow across a cut to be just you replace the C with the F. But mind you, because of skew symmetry, this is very peculiar. You are essentially the flow from S to T can also be seen as a negative of the flow from T to S, which is not the case with the capacities. Remember, capacities, the links going this way have no reason to be symmetrical or even anti-symmetrical with the links going the other way. So, when you are looking at capacity, you are going from left to right. When you are looking at flows, you are of course going from left to right with all the flows, but each one has a negative on the other side. You can actually calculate it the other way too. But it is essentially the stuff going from the left to the right. Okay? Okay. Yes. Okay. It is actually mathematically looks trivial. You have the capacity of a cut to be the sum of all the capacities from the left side, where the source is also sitting, to the right side where the sink is sitting, because the definition of a cut is take some vertices, put it on the left, take all remaining vertices, put it on the right, make sure that the source is on the left and the sink is on the right. There are all kinds of links going that way too. It is just a bunch of nodes on this side, bunch of nodes on the other side, and you are just looking at links between these nodes. You will have some links within these, some links within these, and some links going this way, some links going that way. The capacity of the cut S comma T is essentially going to be just the sum of all the capacities on the links going from the left to the right, according to this definition. U has to be in S, T has to be in capital V. The flow is very similar. You just take the C and you throw an F in. But I am claiming that just because it is mathematically looking similar, algebraically or expression wise looking similar, does not mean that conceptually it is similar. Conceptually it is very different. In this case, in the case of the capacity of the cut, you are just adding up the capacities on the links going from the left to the right. All the other links you discard, links going this way. Whereas, in the case of a flow through from S to T, you are essentially adding up all the flows, and sometimes you will see that there is a negative flow from the left to the right. That means that there is a positive flow on the other side. You are essentially for every pair of vertices, one on the left, one on the right, adding up the flow moving in that direction. So, the flow brings the skew symmetry with itself. Therefore, the flow from T to S by definition turns out to be the negative of the flow of S to T. That is not the case with the cut. The skew symmetry happens by definition, whereas the capacity from S to T is not the capacity or the negative of the capacity from T to S. They are completely different numbers. That is what I wanted to point out. So, conceptually they are very different. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay, good. Okay, very powerful theorem. It is saying that you take any cut in your network. Of course, mind you, the S has to be sitting on this side and the T has to be sitting on that side. You take any cut, and the claim is that if you calculate the flow across the cut, that will exactly be the flow in your network. Conceptually, it is easy to see. You take any cuts that essentially partitions one side from the other. So, T is sitting on that side, S is sitting on this side. Anything that has to go from S to T has to pass through the cut, and therefore, it gets accounted for. But this is the conceptual aspect of things. You are sending stuff from S, it is going to end up at T, therefore, has to cross this barrier and then gets accounted for. But proving this might not be that easy, because there might be stuff coming back in. There might be stuff going within areas. Once again, because of algebra, this becomes a trivial thing to show. Mind you, this thing is by definition what? What is the definition of flow? Algebraically, you just take the source and sum over all V's. That is your flow. Remember, everybody else is a node which is flow conservation. Therefore, S, f of S comma V is the flow. We also know f of V comma T is also the flow. So, this we will just choose to be f of S comma V. So, we have to show that f of S comma T is f of S comma V. So, I want to set up the right side first. So, what I will do is f of S comma V what is that? What is T? Yes. V minus T is S. What is this? Okay, by simply skew symmetry and it be appearing on both sides. So, we are left with f of S comma V, which I can split up into f of small s comma V plus f of and I now claim that this is 0. Why is that? F of small s minus s comma V, these are individual nodes. It does not involve either the source or the sink, and I know that f of u comma capital V for every such node is 0. Flow conservation, and that immediately gives me this. Once again, the power of algebra, or rather the power of a concept, is that when put in algebra makes things so simple to prove. Okay. So, we have just shown that given any S comma T, the flow across S comma T is going to be the flow coming in from your source node, and that is the flow in your network. Okay, once again, yeah. This part? Okay. So you're happy with f of s comma t being f of capital S comma v and this going away. This line? This one? Above this. Okay. This is by definition f of capital S comma capital T. And I said what a flow is. It's essentially sum of all flows from the left side to the right side, whatever be in the left side, whatever be on the right side. That is the definition of a flow across a cut. The definition of a flow in a network, which is this, is earlier we talked about it. If it is f of start from the source node and go to every vertex in your network. So there is something to be proved. We are claiming that whatever this be, that will turn out to be the same thing. So we are proving that. So this is not obvious. One is by definition what is going across a cut. The other is by definition what is coming in from the source node, which is getting distributed to the rest of the network. Of course, the proof is just algebraic. Yeah. This one where? Up there? No, it is not. F of small t is the flow going from S to small t through that link. Okay, so it's a very good question. I want to remind some of you what is really happening. You see flows as not just the flows on these links, but the real flow going from the source to the sink. The definition of a flow is not that. The definition of a flow is not what is ending up reaching the other place through all kinds of links. The definition of a flow is how much is going from here to there through a link in between them. If there is no link between them, then we claim it is 0. F of small s comma small t can be 0 because there is no link between them. Of course, what is really happening is that you have links going from S to some node to T, but that is not accounted for in F. Small f is only pairwise and it only looks at immediate links. It is a very important thing. If you miss this part, this whole thing will be nonsense to you. The flow is not between flow f is not defined as how much stuff goes from U to V. It defines how much goes from U to V on a link between U and V. Everybody else, other people will take care of. I don't care about them. I'll just look at these guys. Yeah. Directed edge, single directed edge. If there is no directed edge, flow is 0. No multiple components. Direct edge, single edge, direct edge. Everybody else is taken care of by other flows. This is just a matter of doing the algebra right. So this one has a bunch of nodes, this one has a bunch of nodes, this is a summation on those nodes. Remember, once you say how much stuff goes from S to T, not just through these links, but also through other links, double, triple hops, what really happens then is that you might end up accounting for the same thing 10 times. One is directly going, one is through this one. Maybe the first time you don't account for it, but this guy accounts for it. So things get complicated. So what you do is that you define the flow essentially to be just pairwise. And these pairs are not pairwise in the sense of you can take many jumps to get there. Look and see if there is a single hop between these two guys. If there is a pipe, just account for that flow. All the other flows will be accounted for by the other people. That is why the definition of a flow through a network is so peculiar. You say from the source through direct pipes to everybody, not indirect pipes. Because if you do direct pipes and indirect pipes, you will account for it 2 or 3 times. That's why this definition. Direct links from the source to all the nodes in your graph, including itself. and that is a flow. And essentially you are saying that is the stuff going in from here and immediately getting distributed by direct links to everybody else, and then some nonsense is happening and something comes up. I will just look at the immediate flow out of the source. Is that making sense? Yeah.
How do you define the flow of a network?
This is by definition the flow of the network. You don't want to get confused about what is going where. So what you say is that every node, because of skew symmetry, now you are getting to understand the power of skew symmetry. You simply say by skew symmetry, every node other than the source and the sink has flow conservation, 0. Only the source and the sink have non-zero. You simply look at the stuff going out of the source, immediate single links, not jumping to something and then something else and so on, just single links out of the source. That is this flow in the network. That is the definition. And so there is something to be shown. Yeah. Okay, so you're happy with this split. I take S comma V and split it into small s and the remaining. I now claim that this is 0 because of flow conservation. All nodes except for source and sink have sum of 0. No. Flow conservation is individually any node which is neither the source nor the sink. If you sum up all the flows on that, you will get a 0. I am going to take this piece and split it up according to the nodes on the left. Each individual node with a capital V on the right. Each individual node here is neither S nor T, because capital S does not include T, and I have taken small s. That's it. Any other questions? It takes a little time. I will keep talking about the skew symmetry, you will not understand what is happening, but it is very important for you to realize that the flow is not being defined as conceptually what you think is the flow, which is how much stuff ends up from point A to point B. In fact, you cannot really tell. It is like water. You don't know whether molecules are labeled, that it actually came from here to there. It could have come from someplace else. So all you do is you just look at individual links and say how much is going through that link. Everything else, let the algebra take care of. Yeah.
So the flow of the network equal to the flow of a cut, which is
That is that theorem. So now I am claiming that because I have just shown this, that you give me any flow, it will be the flow across a cut. You take any cut and it will be the flow, right. So I put a flow in, it is a flow of 20. 20 is going in through the source node. I guarantee you, if 20 is going through the source node, you give me any cut and 20 will be going across that cut, wherever that cut be, so long as the source is sitting on this side and the sink is sitting on that side. That is what this one said. That can now be used to say the following: the value of any flow f in a flow network is bounded from above by the capacity of all cuts. You give me a flow and I guarantee you that every cut in that network, the capacity of the cut will be greater or equal to the flow that you have just produced. Otherwise, it is not a flow. Why is that? Any cut has to have a capacity higher or equal to the flow that you have just shown me. I use this theorem. This theorem says that if you give me a flow, that immediately means that it is the flow through any cut. And the flow through any cut is less than equal to the capacity of that cut. And that is trivial, right. So f of s comma t is less than equal to c of s comma t. Why is that? Exactly, because of the way we define things. This one is summation f u v, u belongs to s and v belongs to t, and the other side is summation c u v, u belongs to s and v belongs to t. And each individual flow is smaller than each individual capacity. And although conceptually they are different, because every piece is less than every piece on the right, this one just goes through. Okay? So the algebra is very simple, but conceptually it is saying something even much stronger. Remember, the flow across a cut can be seen as the negative of the flow across that cut, whereas the capacity of a cut cannot be seen as the negative of the capacity, but this one just algebra pushes it through. It's saying you give me any cut, and I immediately know that the flow coming in from S is the flow passing through there, and therefore has to be less than equal to the capacity of that cut. Yeah.
So now if we guarantee that some flow is equal capacity, we are done.
Yes, that's what. So now we have to show that. But essentially where we are leading to is the following. If you can find me the min cut, and if you hit the capacity of that cut, you cannot improve beyond it. That is immediate, because any flow has to be less than the capacity of all cuts. And if I find the min cut, that's the most you can push through across that cut, and that will be your flow. That is why min cut max flow theorem. The max flow will be the min cut. Okay, so let's prove that now. Okay, so this is the max flow min cut theorem. It's essentially saying that if F is any flow in a network G, then 1, 2, and 3 are equivalent, by which we mean that if 1 is the case, so is 2 and 3 the case. If 2 is the case, so is 1 and 3 the case. If 3 is the case, so is 1 and 2 the case. 1 basically says F is the maximum flow. 2 says that the residual network has no augmenting path. So if you keep augmenting, you will get stuck. And 3, that the flow, this flow, is actually the capacity of some cut. So you hit any one of these, and you immediately have the maximum flow. So the way Ford-Fulkerson will prove that it is a max flow, it will simply say there is no residual. Okay? So I cannot put an augmenting path, so I have hit 1. And that's it. Making sense? I have to show that 1, 2, and 3 are equivalent. Ford-Fulkerson can prove that it has a max flow by saying that, look, I cannot find an augmenting path in my residual network. By this theorem, therefore, I am the max flow. The last one is saying that flow will be the capacity of some cut. There is some cut on which it will be the capacity, meaning summation of C u to V will be F of small s comma capital B, or F of capital S capital T. So the flow across that cut will be the capacity of that cut. Okay, so here is another trick in mathematics. When you are trying to prove 1, 2, and 3 are equivalent, you might think that the best way to show this is take 1 and 2 and show 1 implies 2, 2 implies 1. then take 2 and 3 and say 2 implies 3, 3 implies 2, and then you have to take 1 and 3 saying 1 implies 3, 3 implies 1. Too many implications you have to show. What they do in mathematics is something very beautiful. They find a line of argument that just spins you through these guys. So, what they usually do is they line it up in such a manner that you will just have to show 1 implies 2, not the other way around, 2 implies 3, not the other way around, and then 3 implies 1, and so you make a circle. This is a standard technique in mathematics. You will see a lot of proofs going this way. When they prove A, B, and C are equivalent, they simply go direct, and then the last one latches on to the back side. Okay, so here, why is 1 implies 2? I claim that 1 implies 2 is trivial. And the reason for that is the following. Let us say that F is a maximum flow, but 2 is broken. In other words, in the residual network, you do find an augmenting path. Then F cannot be the maximum flow. Why? Because the augmenting path, because of the previous theorem, the flow on that augmenting path can be added to F to make it an even bigger flow. Very simple argument. So, if F is a maximum flow, you cannot have an augmenting path. If you did, F would not be the maximum flow. This is slightly more difficult. So, you are saying that you cannot find an augmenting path, and you have to prove that the flow E is the capacity of some cut out there, S comma T. We do not even know. Here is the beauty of things. When you cannot find an augmenting path, it immediately points to you the cut itself. Okay, it is a strange thing. When you cannot find an augmenting path, it means that it is showing you the bottleneck. It is showing you where things have gone bad. How do you do that? What you do is you take S and do some graph traversal and collect all the nodes that you can get to really. From S, you can get to bunch of nodes in the residual network. So, you are given the residual network for that particular flow, and from S essentially go and find all the nodes that you can actually get to. In other words, there are links to these nodes with some residual capacity in it. Very clearly, since there is no augmenting path, you will not be able to get to T. You will not find any path that takes you to T. So, essentially every way you go from S, you will not be able to jump across to T, because if you could, then you have an augmenting path. Take all the nodes that you can go to from S and call them S. Call the remaining T. Clearly, small t is sitting there, because if you could go from S to T, there would be an augmenting path. There isn't one. So, by definition, T is already sitting on the right, and if you can go from S to everybody else in graph, then all of V will be sitting here. There will still be some small t there. Otherwise, you will not be able to get to some guys. Okay? I claim that this is this cut. Why? There are nodes on this side and nodes on the other side, and there is no way you can go from the left to the right. Why? By definition, those guys on the other side. So, there are no edges from the left nodes to the right nodes. That means that the residual capacities on those edges are all 0. The residual capacities from the left to the right is 0. That is why that link does not exist. That is why you cannot cross over. But if the residual capacity is 0, it means that C minus F is 0, which means that C is F. It is a very beautiful argument. And because C is F, sum over all C is sum over all F for all those things. And therefore, your flow, which we have shown is F of capital S comma capital T, will be C of capital S comma capital T for that cut. Okay? This is the more difficult part of the argument. So, I have shown you 1 to 2, I just showed you 2 to 3, I need to show you 3 to 1. Yes.
Can you please again?
Okay, 2 to 3, one last time. 2 says that the residual network has no augmenting path. I have to prove that there exists some cut for which the flow is exactly equal to the cut. The way I do it is the following. Because there is no augmenting path, I am guaranteed the following. If I start from this source and look at all the edges that I can take to other nodes in the graph, which are edges with residual capacities on them, then I am guaranteed that because there is no augmenting path, I will not be able to reach T. If I could reach T using a path, T, S to T would be the augmenting path. There is no augmenting path. So, I might be able to go from S to some nodes, but I will never reach T. What I do is I take the graph and split it into 2 pieces. On the left side are all the nodes that I can get from S to. I take them all, put it here. T is of course sitting on the right side and maybe some other nodes. I do not know. I am just looking from S and I am just running a traversal algorithm to collect all the nodes that I can get to in the residual network. What I am then guaranteed is that T is sitting on the right and that there are no edges from the left to the right. By no edges, I mean no edges with, remember, if an edge has a value of 0, it is not an edge anymore, it gets taken out. That is how I am guaranteed that I cannot go from the left to the right, because if I could, I would pull that node in to this side. So, these are all edges from left to the right, which are non-edges, which have a value of 0 on them. The residual graph has a value of 0. That means that the capacity is equal to the flow on that. That is why the residual network has no edge there between those pair of nodes. The residual capacity is 0. What does that mean? Remember the previous theorem we had shown. The residual capacity is the capacity minus the flow. If the residual capacity is 0, it means that the capacity is equal to the flow on that link. And this is for every pair of link from one node on the left and one node on the right. The capacity of this cut is summation over all CUVs. I just showed you that each CUV is also equal to FUV. So, the summation of FUV is summation of CUV. So, the flow across this cut is the capacity of the cut, and we have already shown that the flow across that cut is the flow in. So, the flow is the capacity of that particular cut. This is the cut produced by trying to produce an augmenting path and not getting to be able to do it anymore. So, you can go from the source to a bunch of guys, but that is it, you are not being able to cross over to T or T and few other guys. Sometimes it is just T, all the links, the last link you cannot cross. Sometimes there are more links, more nodes there. You can go to some nodes, but that last jump you are not being able to make to get to T. Okay? Last piece, which I am going to go from 3 to 1 directly. So, if the flow is the capacity of some cut, I claim that it has to be a max flow. Why is that? I have shown that any flow has to be bounded from above by the capacity of any cut. Soon as it becomes the capacity of some cut, you cannot increase it anymore, and therefore, it is a max flow. It is a strange kind of argument where I step you from 1 to 2, 2 to 3 and then 3 to 1 again. Each piece put together now says all of these are equal. So, how many people did not get the last piece of the argument? I am claiming that if the flow is the capacity of some cut, I am guaranteed that it is a max flow. In other words, it cannot be increased. How many did not get it? How many got it? Okay, very nice. The argument is very simple. If the flow is the capacity of some cut, because every cut bounds the flow from above. Soon as you have the flow hitting one cut, if you add it slightly more, this guy would not bound it anymore, and therefore it is the maximum you can reach. That is why the flow can only be brought up to the capacity of the minimum cut, because every cut bounds it from above. That is why the max flow min cut theorem. Okay. One last piece of thing. It is very strange that this flow algorithm can be used to solve a problem that looks very different. Okay. So, let me point that out and then we can go home. Okay, it is a very general problem. On the surface, looks like a very difficult problem to solve. It is called the maximum bipartite matching. Okay. So, in this is this notion of a bipartite. So, what is bipartite? A bipartite graph is any graph G such that you have a partition of nodes, so that the edges are only between the partition. In other words, a bipartite graph looks something like that. There will be no edges between these, there will be no edges between these. The only edges are from left to right or right to left. In this particular case, it is undirected, so you will have stuff that looks like that. That is a bipartite graph. Okay, so, a bipartite graph is any graph G, so that it can be partitioned into two sets. Let us not call it S and T. Any two sets V and G minus V, such that there are no edges between V and there are no edges between G minus V. All edges are between these two guys. Okay. The maximum bipartite matching is a problem where I want you to find a maximum matching between points on the left and points on the right. Okay. A good way to see this is a bunch of guys, a bunch of women. You know which guys like which women, you know which women like which guys. You want to match them up so that you can get maximum number of pairings. You can immediately see that you cannot prove that, you cannot do this in a greedy way. So, I will give you an example. Okay, so, here are two guys and here are two women. It turns out that both guys like this woman, this guy likes this woman, right. If I essentially match this one to there, so if we make this matching, then because this guy and this woman do not like each other, you cannot get a second match. So, the way to do this matching is to somehow figure out that because both of them like this, go with this guy who essentially likes this woman. So, have this as a match, and so then you can match these. So, this is a bigger matching than the previous case. So, I just give you a graph, I tell you guys on this side, women on this side, pair wise who likes whom, produce for me the best set of matchings so that we can have a big dance. Okay, you do not want to have guys sitting there sulking, women sitting there sulking because they could not be matched. It is a very important problem. Matching A to B so that you get the maximum number of matches is found everywhere in the world. We would like to solve this problem. It turns out that I can solve this problem using max flow. I will not give you the solution. Okay, I will come back next time and give you the solution. Just think about it. It looks like there is no relationship between the two sides. But it turns out that that problem is actually solved using this one. Okay? We will stop here.